when we talk about structure, what first are we discussing with that? And then what are some of the options that play into how that draft structure actually plays out?
And this is a question that comes in sort of referencing one of the things that we talk about, obviously, on OT, but also that we talk about on Stealing Bananas a lot. And you'll hear Ben say that you want to stay in structure, and if you get out of structure, to make sure you get back as quickly as possible. And that may sound a little bit odd, because I think that the first thing that we tend to think is that if there's a structure, you have to follow it. I mean, you're either in structure or you're not in structure. And then there's this question of, is it sort of a bizarre way to look at it in general? But structural drafting has been sort of the foundation at RotoViz since the birth, back in 2013. So this has been very important to us for a long time. And it's one of the edges that I think that we've given readers and listeners for a long time. This idea that there are ways to build your draft that, regardless of which players you choose, that structure is going to be more effective than most other ways of doing it. Now, then when you add elite player selection on top of that, that's when you start to get to the top of these tournaments. That's when you start to do well in your dynasty leagues and build these permanent championship windows that we're talking about. But sort of a good starting point for this discussion, I think, is to look at the beginning of drafts, because if you're going to be in structure, you have to have that plan right from the start. But the great thing here is that it's actually something that gives you freedom, that gives you this ability to use your creativity and amplifies your player selection, as opposed to be something that's limiting. And one of the reasons that we have that is that when you look at these early rounds, there are really three main ways that we can go, and then we can build everything else in off of that, right? But so the three main approaches would be zero running back, legendary running back, or hyper fragile. And the nice thing about having three very effective structures is that you can actually do what you want at the running back position, sort of regardless of what anyone else is telling you. And you can also do what you want at the running back position that fits your draft slot. Because one of the things that we find is that the specific players who are there do matter, right? And if you have a pick in the first 3 or 4, that's going to be very different than having a pick in the middle, and certainly very different than having a pick at the end. So then the great thing about this is we can let our approach to the draft really flow off of the players who are available to us early. And we can also feel free to select a running back or not based on precisely who's there. The key then, Colm, is that based on what we do early, we do have some very specific things, and specific again with this freedom that's important, but we have things that we want to do as we move throughout the draft.
Yeah, so let's focus maybe on one of the three, and I think the listeners will probably enjoy if we go with zero RB for the overall structure that we're going for. So when we start off, and let's say we go wide receiver to start off, and we're looking at that overall structure, and when Ben's talking about moving out of structure, then that might be going into maybe from zero RB to modified zero RB and moving into getting a running back in the 4th round. Sometimes then you could even divert, and the offer could be the running back sitting for you there in the 5th round could be too much, and maybe you have to go in there again and take that second running back. So you're starting out 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs. And then when we're looking at the overall structure of that draft, how are we looking at getting back into the structure? So when we're talking about structure, are we looking specifically at we want to have this amount of running backs through this amount of rounds, or how are you defining that?
Yeah, so if we start with the idea of zero running back, then that's a perfect one for this idea of staying in structure, or if you get out of structure to get back in structure. And the example that you give is maybe an example of getting out of structure and staying out problematically, right? And so one of the things that we have looked at for a long time is this idea of, if you're going to do a zero RB draft, and this is even more true in redraft than say best ball, where we want to make sure we're continuing to draft wide receivers through these rounds where the wide receiver scoring is very strong, and we're going to build both elite wide receiver upside with those top receivers, And then also make sure that we get exposure to the breakout guys, whether these are second-year guys or players who we are very high on and have this ability to outperform ADP by a wide margin, perhaps for a different reason. But we have to have exposure to those players as well. If you're only taking the wide receivers at the beginning and then you're moving to running back in the dead zone, that's going to be an element where you've gotten out of structure very much to the detriment of your roster, right? The cool thing about 2022, however, is that we are seeing a little bit of a different mix of players. And this, I think, is a natural reaction in some ways to the spread of these ideas sort of out into the wider fantasy football sphere. And as a result of that, you have more drafters who are using correct structure, and then that's going to then have an effect on what's happening, both in this sort of wide receiver sweet spot in this running back dead zone. We have a few guys in that range who are interesting, thinking in terms of some players like a Breece Hall or a J.K. Dobbins or a Travis Etienne. Now, one of the things that may happen is that if those players do appear to be healthy, in Hall's case, if he appears to be, quickly earning most of the snaps, we would expect their ADPs to rise. One of the things that we tend to see is that some of these backs who are a lot of fun that you can get at pretty good prices in May, they end up being pretty expensive in August, and then you're kind of back to your traditional dead zone. But one of the things that you might want to do, and this would be an example of getting out of structure and then getting back in, would be something like taking your legendary running back in the dead zone instead of trying to hit that player in the first or second round. And I say legendary because I like the way that Patrick Carrain termed that. And we're looking at how elite the scoring actually has to be, what your upside has to be to burn these early picks. That's the same thing in the dead zone. If you're going to take a running back in an area that historically has been very poor for running back scoring and for running back win rates, then you need that player to have the type of profile that's going to win the whole thing for you, not just fill that spot. One of the things that staying in structure does and reminds you of is that you cannot chase points. You cannot select players at positions just to fill out your lineup or because you have a starting spot available. That will not work, right? And that's sort of the biggest mistake that we see from drafters. But last year, for example, you had DeAndre Swift going in this range that would be dead zone-ish. And he was someone that we identified as being a player who was just very incorrectly valued. And so we wanted to go ahead and take a shot at him. If we start wide receiver, take Swift, and then getting back into structure, will be right back to the wide receivers and or making sure that we get that elite tight end in there.
You mentioned something there, and I just wanted to bring it up as people, when we're trying to stay in structure for us, other people are drafting and they're trying to fill out their roster spots. So they may be thinking of the structure as, I need to get these players to fit into my starting lineup before I worry about the bench spots. What are some of the other common mistakes that you might see with people in structure and not fully understanding how to implement that? And I guess that comes across the three different types of draft structures that you mentioned in Zero RB, kind of Hero RB or modified Zero RB, and then anti-fragile.
Right. And this is an area where it just is very easy to mention this series that Connor O'Driscoll has written over the last couple of weeks for the site. And it focuses on each of these different approaches and uses the new and fantastic Underdog tools to really flesh out how they work within that tournament. I do a series every year called the Best Ball Workshop, where I do a similar type of thing for the FFPC standalone events and for the tournament. And the cool thing about his pieces is that he goes through and explains why they work, how they work, and the mistakes the drafters make that cause them to not work. And the most recent one was on hyperfragile. And that tends to be the term that we give when you start with the three running backs early. Now, the three running backs early has some huge problems with it, right? And it's one of the reasons why we go zero running back most of the time. But there's also a way that you can play this out that can be fairly effective, does give you some upside. Certainly, it would give you upside in a scenario where the backs out of the 101 and the 102 stay healthy. I mean, one of the things that's happened, really since 2016 is that the top backs have had this crazy injury rate. And we know that that is something that will happen to the running backs, but it is in a way a little bit fluky that it's happened so much to the top couple. And then in the middle of that first round, you've had better health, which is one of the reasons why those middle slots, especially then wrapping back around to where if you wanted to go running back, you're going to have some decent options, and people have had some hits there. So if you do it running back, and then you draft very much set again in structure the rest of the way through, you can have some success. If we had these top guys stay healthy, then you perhaps have this extreme upside type of team out of the 101 or the 102. But in order to make that work, you've got to do a lot of other things correctly. And one of the kind of funny things here is you go and you play with the roster construction explorers, and it'll tell you, okay, if you want to do an anchor running back team, then it is important that you draft that running back 2 later than is intuitive. If you're going to start running back, it's even more important to draft that third running back later than you might want to. And then especially if you're going to start running back ×3 and have this sort of hyper fragile approach, you need to draft the running back 4 very late and maybe only do 4 total, which, people will get midway through the draft. They'll see a guy that they like and think, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and make this extra pick. This player is also a value. Or they'll get in that 10, 11 round range and they'll feel like, okay, 3 isn't enough. This isn't going to work out. If somebody gets hurt, then what do I do? Well, the problem is that if those players get hurt, you're going to lose. And you have to kind of be okay with that. And going in that one of the things that you're trying to do, if you're looking at a 12-team league, you're trying to get that win rate from that 8.3% up to, you can legitimately push it into the 15, 16 type of range if you do everything right from a structural perspective. And that's one of the things that we emphasize staying in structure so much because of. You want to push it up there, right? If you're looking at an underdog tournament, you're looking to push that advance rate, 5, 6, 7% above what the average would be. And again, you can do some of those things if you make the rest of these decisions correctly. So that would be one thing that you need to do is after you've taken whatever your running back approach is early, you got to push your next picks much later than might feel comfortable.
Yeah, that was good. And you mentioned they're kind of like going back in maybe the 8th round, maybe have taken 2 running backs early and seeing, this guy can't pass up on him, but it's going to take you right out of that structure. A couple of questions to follow up with that. If you go out of that structure, is it possible to get back into structure as the draft progresses, or is your structure crumbling down around you?
Well, the biggest problem that you're going to have is that if you end up with too many backs in the first 10 rounds, and if you end up with too many backs in the dead zone, you could still win, right? It's not like your win rate drops to 0. So, there are going to be individual managers out there who have drafted a team like that has won. Because again, it doesn't go to 0. But you're going to have a lot of things go right for you, and you're very much swimming upstream in terms of the probabilities. So it's not going to be very easy, and it's not really realistic to think in terms of getting back into structure if you make some serious running back mistakes. The great thing about the structure is it does give you that flexibility to do at least some things at running back in the first, say, 6 rounds and not feel like you're definitely dead. But then with that, it does help. And one of the things that is kind of fun, and many of our listeners will have checked out the FFPC Superflex Best Ball Tournament draft that Ben Gretchen and I did for sort of a special draft episode of Stealing Bananas. And we got into this situation kind of in a different format that has some different structural elements where you would say that we were out of structure, right? You're in the Superflex tournament. It very much benefits you to start with early quarterbacks, but because I was drafting with Ben and because Ben is a jinx when it comes to draft slot, we had the 111, and really the 10 quarterbacks that we were interested in, or I should say the 9 quarterbacks plus obviously Jonathan Taylor. Those guys were gone. And we always talk about chasing points, and you don't want to chase points. That's going to be true at quarterback as well as running back. So we pivoted and we selected Christian McCaffrey and Jamar Chase with our first 2 picks. And I love that, right? Because now you've got maybe the 2 best players. I mean, maybe the 2 best players in the NFL, right? And from that point, then you're trying to do everything right to make sure that you maximize your chances. And so one of the things that we see is that at tight end, you want to, and this is sort of across formats, you want to get that elite tight end. If you do get the elite tight end, there are many situations. Now, there are some FFPC formats that this wouldn't be true for because the tight end is so potent. But if you get that elite tight end, then you can go with 2 tight ends and you save yourself a roster spot. But if you miss on the elite tight end, you can't reach for the compromised guys. You have to wait and then take 3, again, in this range that the scoring and the results have been strong, and give yourself the chance with an extra guy to get that hit and to look at your breakouts. And again, I think one of the things that's fun about this column is that you do have some flexibility, and not every draft has to be exactly the same. If you have some tight ends that you like as breakout candidates, there is a structure that works within. So you don't have to go into every draft and say, okay, I mean, it's not really what I want to do, but I have to force myself to take one of these tight ends, especially in 2022, where maybe you're looking at it and say, Darren Waller with Devontae Adams, I'm less excited about that. George Kittle with Trey Lance and 2 potentially elite wide receivers, I'm not as excited about that. Mark Andrews kind of going back into an environment where, you know, they're probably going to be run heavy, that there are signals to that effect. I'm optimistic that it's not going to go all the way back to what it was before, but you had a very specific scenario that took place to get Mark Andrews where he was. And we love that. We were all over Mark Andrews. So, I mean, that's the dream. But now that he's up higher again, now that he's a 2nd round pick in so many different formats, I mean, you have to pay for a lot of what happened last year. Whereas for everybody drafting him in 2021, they had this scenario that could be a league winning scenario, and they didn't have to pay for nearly as much of it. And so, you know, that has to factor into what you're looking at this season. And then Travis Kelce, I mean, he's just a game wrecker in terms of what he does for fantasy. And yet we're going into a year where he's a little bit older. He had the fast finish last season, but for most of last year, he was not nearly as dynamic. You know, Tyreek Hill leaves, but there's probably more target competition in 2022. And so you go across those guys and you think, well, I mean, I want to be price sensitive as I'm landing these players because each one of them has a real concern. And so the great thing about the structural drafting is that you do get different options. And, you know, another thing that goes into how to play this is you want to have the right quarterback approach as well. That's going to change a little bit by format, but it is important. Again, the cool thing about it is that there are some different things you can do. It doesn't lock you into taking the exact same guys in every single draft, which I don't think would be very fun, right? But when you put the running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback approaches together, then suddenly you have something that's very dynamic and does give you a significant advantage. And so while there are ways to move it, if you make a decision early, it's going to have a consequence down the line that you have to know that you need to shift, but that shift needs to be to something that works within what you did. It can't simply be, okay, well, now I've done something that maybe some of the roster construction explorers or some of the experts tell me is mildly suboptimal. So now I just go through the draft and pick whomever.
Yeah, and the other thing, you covered a lot of things. I wrote down a couple of questions I was going to pitch in there, and it's around the overall structure and the players. So a lot of times, I think the misconception around the likes of Zero RB is that it's Zero RB, but it's not zero tight end or zero quarterback. And sometimes there'll be questions that come in around drafting the quarterback or drafting the tight end. You covered it very well there around the elite tight end options, or then waiting was something else that you mentioned. And using the RotoViz tools, you're able to see the win rates like you touched on as well. But you can see why you have to wait until after a certain point, or why you're trying to draft those quarterbacks in the window. And when you're looking at those and pitching it all together, it's like is it like a jigsaw for you where you're getting the structure, but you're also getting the player profiles, but you're also putting those win rates into to mix it all together for yourself?
Yeah. And one of the things that we do when you and I draft together is we put together our board and we're looking at guys within specific rounds that appear to be, you could say somewhat significantly, but at least somewhat undervalued, right? But also undervalued from this perspective that there's a scenario where they could dramatically outplay their cost, and that scenario isn't necessarily perfectly priced. One of the things that I was thinking about this morning is this idea that you'll have players come in and hit other guys, free agency, the draft. In most cases, that actually won't change my exposure to the players I was on previously that much. It'll just change the price at which I select them, because that scenario where they're a league winner in most cases is still there. It may now have a lesser chance of happening, but as the price drops down, as the community reacts, then you still have this ability then to select the player, play that scenario out. But the great thing about structure, and the cool thing here, is that the structures work in part because they tend to push you in the direction of the type of player who can outperform the price kind of in that range of the draft. And so we're trying to marry these two things. Number one, the structure is going to help us make sure that we have a team that works, has the right pieces at the right prices, and historically have done very well there. But then also we're bringing in our player selection criteria as we go through the different rounds. And in any individual year, we're going to be heavier on certain guys at certain places, and maybe even a little bit heavier on certain structures, because the players who are available in that year really fit a certain approach. And I think that that's been one of the fun things to look at in 2022, is just this interaction between the structures that work and the players and prices that are there to find that overlap, that intersection, is really what putting your draft plan together is about. And then you go through the different drafts and you see how they come out, and you look at them after the fact, you give yourself some feedback, you try to make sure they're better. Colm, you and I talk about going into drafts, and you should never come out of a draft and say, well, I don't like my draft, because you should never be drafting players that you don't like, that you don't think have upside, or that you don't want to root for. So make sure that you have that as the first thing. And then you're not going to have a draft and come out of it and say, I don't like this. I mean, one of the things about the draft that Ben and I did is we joked with each other a lot about the fact that our quarterbacks were not very good and we were going to need a specific thing to happen. But it's not like we didn't like the team, because we drafted good players, and we drafted players that we like, and we drafted for scenarios that could play out and allow us to win. Now, there are obviously some counter scenarios to where that team doesn't do well, but again, finishing 6th or finishing 9th is more or less irrelevant. If you draft and structure, I mean, you're going to have a lot of injuries, and there will be some teams out there, especially in best ball, where you can't fill in, throughout the year with waivers. There are going to be some teams that are absolutely crushed by injuries. And yes, those teams probably are going to fit, in that bottom third. But the vast majority of your teams, if you draft within the structure, it's very difficult to push them below the midway point. But even then, I mean, what you're looking for is not finishing top 6 unless you're in a double up. What you're looking for is to win, if it's a tournament, to get into the tournament and to have a mix of players that have this scenario that play out and allow you to win the tournament, right? So we're looking at it from a player perspective, from a structure perspective, and from a scenario perspective, all of those things fitting together to give us this potential super team.